This series of videos is being created to remind the world of the 100-year era between when the Civil War ended and the Civil Rights Movement came to pass. Most of these stories are gruesome, despicable, and horrific, but they need to be told in order for certain critics of present-day political agendas to have an accurate representation of what life was like for blacks after slavery. Too often there's an almost purposeful ignorance, a contempt for those of color, and a stain on the true horrors that African Americans faced daily. A life without justice, a life of oppression, a life without safety. These are their stories. The pages of history hold tales of despicable crimes against African Americans following the end of the Civil War and the passing of Juneteenth. Despite their hard-won right to be free citizens of the United States, the burden of systemic racism was soon realized throughout the nation. From suppressing the right to vote, to lynchings, to Jim Crow laws adopted, African Americans were positioned in the depths of our darkest prejudice. For despite having won their freedom, the black community lived in fear, even in states like Arkansas. This is where the story of Isadore Banks unfolds. In a small town called Marion, Isadore Banks entered the world in the year 1895. This particular region was engulfed in a pressurized clash against whites and blacks during Isadore's youngest years, and it only continued to worsen as he aged. Regardless of the racial tension a young black man like Isadore faced growing up in Arkansas, Isadore was not your average rule. In fact, Banks had created a life for himself that afforded him a hefty social standing which stemmed from the wealth of his 1,000-acre farmland, sales of land to local townspeople, and he additionally owned several businesses as well. Isadore was known to be a hard-working young man, and in the year 1917, at the height of the First World War, Isadore was drafted, returning from overseas after 1 year as an American veteran. Upon his return, he continued to patriotically give back to his local community, often supplying the black schools with supplies and granting personal loans to poor farmers in the area. It seems that Isadore was leading a very promising life. That's when he met and fell in love with Alice Biggs. Though they endured chastising by white citizens in Marion, the Banks family lived undisturbed by severe discrimination until the year 1954. On June 18th, Alice said goodbye to Isadore as he was off to pay the farmers their wages. She watched her husband leave the property towards town, but he did not return later that evening. In a panic, Alice reported his disappearance at once to the police, and thus began the search for Isadore. Days passed, and no signs of the 300-pound man were detected. Alice, relentless in her efforts to find the man she loved, continued the search diligently. On the fourth day, Isadore was found. A man named Carl Kroom, who was assisting in the search party, stated that he stumbled upon the remains in a dense wood because he knew that Isadore had gone to that very area quite often. When the authorities arrived at the crime scene, they were horrified to discover the unrecognizable remains of Mr. Banks hanging from a tree, his mangled body so charred from a ground fire below him that he barely looked human at all. Upon further inspection, it was noted that there was a large hole in the blackened remains of Isadore's abdomen. Later, it would be speculated that this large hole was either from a shotgun blast or a large blade. Although the cause of the hole in his stomach would not be solved, the remains continued to tell a dark story about how Isadore met his fate. On the ground below him were several items left by the killer mob. A set of keys, random coins, and a small empty gas can were strewn about the crime scene, indicating to the officers that he had been executed by more than just a handful of people. Notably, one of the investigators of the scene determined that there were no traces of large bloodstains anywhere within the vicinity of Isadore's lifeless body. Thus, it became a strong possibility that the crime may have been committed elsewhere, and a group of men transferred the body to the location in the woods. A sequence of events began to emerge rapidly during the investigation. Alice was the last to see her husband alive on that early June morning, and it was concluded that after he had left the home, someone attacked him, likely a large group of men due to Banks's heavy size, and they began torturing the victim. Isadore's truck was found not far from the tree that he was hung from, and inside the truck remained his shotgun and leather jacket. This suggests that whomever stopped him on his trip to Marion, Isadore likely approached them without apprehension since he didn't bring his gun, making the murder all the more gut-wrenching when they realized that he likely knew his killers. After being attacked by the perpetrators, Banks would have been beaten and shot multiple times based on the injuries present on the remains. It is unclear to this day, but it's assumed that Isadore was then hung from a tree after the beating, and then he was set on fire. The coroner posited that he was not alive when his body was burned, though no further clarification was given as to why he believed this. The widowed Alice Banks was questioned for hours by the police about her husband's business dealings shortly after the discovery of the body. In her grief-stricken state, Alice was not composed enough to provide any solid lead for the investigation, and before long, the case went stone cold. To add insult to injury, after her husband's passing, Alice was told by the county authorities that Isadore owed taxes on his property, and because of this, the 1,000-acre land would not be inherited by her or their children, but instead it would be auctioned off to the highest bidder in an effort to squeeze blood from a turnip. She lost her husband, she lost the businesses, she lost the home, all over the mysterious death of the man she loved. Over the decades, many suggestions have emerged as to the motive of the lynching. Some have submitted that Isadore was involved in an unfair business practice and may have angered the wrong customer. Others have said it was likely a land sale gone bad that led to the murder. And as with most cases of unsolved black murders during this era, it was also speculated that Isadore was having an affair with a white woman, and perhaps this imaginary woman's husband found out. Unfortunately, the delayed evidence collection, the lack of witness interrogation, and a complete absence of suspects all led to Isadore Banks's murder being all but forgotten to the passage of time. In recent years, an interest began to emerge in unsolved cold cases. Although Marion, Arkansas came equipped with historical records from long ago, there had been a flood in the basement of the courthouse in the early 1980s, destroying the 30-year-old case files. This made Isadore's case all but impossible to re-examine. Additionally, the members of the mob have likely died off over the years, limiting the amount of new information that would have potentially been needed to advance the unsolved crime. In fact, in a 2012 Civil Rights Division court filing, the state of Arkansas legally closed the case, citing, quote, "There is no reasonable possibility that further investigation will lead to a prosecutable case," end quote, and that, quote, "This matter lacks merit and should be closed," end quote. The mind boggles with questions for a failed system of justice over the life that was lost on June 18th. Had an investigation been properly conducted from the start, perhaps justice for the lynching of Isadore Banks would have been granted after all. Instead, the Banks family is without answers, without justice, and without their beloved Isadore, who was killed for simply being wealthy.